locations. Sometimes, while lying awake in the middle of the night, I've even told them to myself. Hollywood stories aren't necessarily suspect. What's worse, time has sanded the rough edges of certain memories, and though I've resisted as best I could the impulse to straighten the narratives, shape the second act, sharpen the dialogue, I'm afraid 50 years of telling stories for a living has left its mark. Let's just say they're as true as they can be, given a reflexive impulse to please, and the hope not to be excommunicated from certain Hollywood parties that I didn't care to attend anyway. And while I'd like to think I've been at least as hard on myself as I am on others, I'll admit that some names have been omitted while others have been kept. In certain cases, this is so as not to be hurtful. In others, it's payback, pure and simple. And speaking of names, I'll be dropping a few. I've come to accept there's no way to tell these stories without being falsely modest or pretentiously unpretentious. Call it the director's paradox. A mere mortal hiding behind the camera, watching the drama of gods and goddesses in the golden glow of the stage lights, and then wading into a shitstorm where he presumes to tell everybody what they're doing wrong. To be a director is to be a changeling. I have played both good cop and bad, psychoanalyst, flirt, camp counselor, drug counselor, scourge, tutor, BFF, coach, con artist, confidant, and co-conspirator. Also a heartless son of a bitch. Sometimes I've been a control freak, trying to bend the world to my will, but just as often a ship's captain standing in the prow of a leaking schooner shouting orders into the wind that only I can hear. Over the years, I've worked with self-proclaimed masters of the universe, unheralded geniuses, hacks, sociopaths, savants, and saints. Mostly I found myself surrounded by brilliant, talented, funny as fuck artists, cast and crew alike, many of whom I've admired for years and who, to my surprise, occasionally even seem interested in my ideas. As for tolerating the appalling behavior of the random, beautiful narcissist, well, that's what my grandfather used to call the cost of doing business. It also must be said that they make for the best stories. Rereading these chapters, I realized while setting out to write about what I learned making movies, I've ended up writing about what movie making has taught me about life. Though told in the guise of Hollywood anecdotes, each one became a kind of life lesson about mentors, monsters, and the meaning of friendship, about the perils of meeting your idols, the complexity of success, and the nobility of failure. Taken together, they become a kind of pilgrim's progress, a sentimental journey from innocence to experience. More parable than pedagogy, these are moral tales, and some aspire to high comedy. There are also melodramas, tragedies, thrillers, and at least one horror story featuring true evil. There are also stories of love and loss, loyalty and betrayal, unexpected heartbreak, and even a triumph or two. Inevitably, each one became a meditation on working, that thing we do every day to which we give so much of ourselves, often at the expense of our families, our health, and a piece of our soul. We know that work creates meaning and purpose all its own, but it also peoples our lives with an entirely different cast of characters than those waiting at home. It offers a separate identity, sometimes even a contingent life. In my case, work has not only defined my life has often been the subject of my work. In ancient Greece, alchemists claimed to be able to transform base metal into gold. They called it transmutation. It was, of course, impossible. But isn't this what a writer presumes to do when he summons up ordinary experience and tries to transform it into art? I was 21, an English major just out of college, working as a PA on a movie. It was called Love and Death. There, I was blessed with my first privileged view as Woody Allen metamorphosed his relationship with Diane Cannon into the script for Annie Hall. But it wasn't until 10 years later that I had a chance to apply what I'd learned. I was in the early days of a career, writing mediocre television with my writing partner, a young man named Marshall Herskovitz. Typically, instead of writing, we were sitting on the kitchen floor of my tiny rented house, playing with my 6-month-old son when my wife, Liberty, tired of listening to us complain about all the idiots in Hollywood who wouldn't hire us, and bored of listening to us bat around one shop-worn idea after another about cops or doctors, when she suggested we might consider writing about something we knew. And she handed us a Booth cartoon she'd cut out from the New Yorker. And in that cartoon, sitting at a desk before an old typewriter, surrounded by balled up wads of paper, is an unshaven, frustrated writer, obviously blocked. Surrounding him are a collection of mangy dogs, large dogs, small dogs, the flea-ridden and the feckless. Behind him in the doorway stands his long-suffering wife. You can almost hear her bitching him out. "Write about dogs," she says. And so we did. No one sets out to create a phenomenon. All we'd hoped was to be true to ourselves. It was head-turning to watch 30-something become common parlance, and giddy to be hailed as generational spokesmen. But it was hard to reconcile that with changing blown-out diapers, eating dinner straight out of the refrigerator, removing our clothes from the backs of chairs where they've been draped for months, barking your shin as you stumbled out of bed for a midnight feeding, and waking up 4 hours later to head into the studio for an early call. The strain on our marriages would have been intense enough had both Liberty and I and Marshall and his wife Susan not all been writing a show about our marriages. I tend to think of it as Bloomsbury in blue jeans. And always at its center was my partnership with Marshall. Our work marriage had predated my conjugal one by a decade. Essentially, one long conversation, occasionally interrupted by the same argument about whose dialogue is better, followed by the same grilled chicken salad at lunch. The secret to our partnership is simple. He's a better writer than I am, also a nicer person. While I tend to go overboard on structure and mise-en-scène, his insistence on digging for the hidden truth beneath every scene and the subtext beneath every line is both maddening and genius. Over time, we've come to resemble each other, like people and their pets. We finish each other's sentences, interrupt each other, even insult each other. The awful things we say sometimes confuses people. But you know how sometimes at the dog park, a good dog will see another dog he knows well, and suddenly for no apparent reason, they begin to bark and snarl at each other, and soon it's escalated into a brawl until they have to be pulled apart? Well, imagine seeing that same dog every day for 50 years, and you begin to get the idea. It's the little tics, once so endearing that makes me want to murder him. Sometimes it's the way he makes that face when he doesn't like an idea of mine. "Why are you making that face?" I ask. "What face?" "The face where you look just like you threw open your mouth." "That's just my face," he says. "Well, get a new face." "Well, fuck you." "No, fuck you." Fun's over, back to work. The best thing about working with Marshall is that he remembers nothing he was written the day before. Nothing. Tabula rasa. It's as if he's had frontotemporal dementia since he was 21 years old. You'd think this could be annoying, but in fact, it also turns out to be unexpectedly helpful because everything is new to him. Each morning when we begin to work, he looks at the script as if he's never seen it before. I sometimes tell him I wrote his lines and he believes me. Other times, he's just as likely to object one of his own ideas from the day before and want to rewrite it until I manage to convince him it was my idea and refuse to change it. Sometimes mine is actually the better idea. Sometimes it's his. Just as often, it's a third idea that's better than either of us could have written alone. Usually, it's something one of us was afraid to suggest because it's shameful or secret, and the other person says, "Write that." We usually begin at 10. I've inevitably been up several times during the night before, anguishing about the day's work while he hasn't given it a thought. Instead, he's read several articles from various obscure medical journals about a condition no one has heard of, and he's convinced he has symptoms. "I don't feel well," he says. "Can we stop now?" By 3 o'clock, we put in a good 5 hours. But once you subtract his trips to the bathroom, calls from our children, wives, snacks, his hourly doses of mysterious new supplements, waiting on hold to speak to our representatives, and the obligatory grilled chicken salad, we will have done maybe 20 minutes work. We're also in the final round of the World Championship Singles Toss the Crumpled Up Page of Paper into the Wastebasket competition. He's hit 9 in a row. If he sinks this one, I've agreed to use his line in the final scene. As he's about to shoot, I sneeze to distract him. He misses, but agrees to my version because I obviously care more. The phone rings. The studio hates my cut. I spiral into full panic mode, convinced I'll never work again. I look over and see he has 2 pens sticking out of his ears, 2 pens in his nostrils, and 2 more in his teeth. "What?" he asks. You used to be a child prodigy, I say. Now you're just a child. He smiles beatifically. Partnerships never tend to last in Hollywood. You don't need him. You could do better on your own, people say. In a town defined by ego, it's commonplace to pay a lawyer, a legion of fluffers to tell you how great you are. Agents, managers, lawyers, publicists, trainers. Yet I've willingly shared half my earnings for the privilege of someone who eagerly tells me I'm full of shit. But when I'm directing, over schedule and over budget, and the studio is threatening to fire me, he's the one who has my back. If a friend is somebody who'll help you move, a partner is someone who'll help you move a body. Still, there have been times I've considered ending it. So has he. Fortunately, neither of us has wanted to do it at the same time. And when I do the play-by-play, who would do the color commentary? I never had a brother. Now I do. He would take a bullet for me, like in the leg or something. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ed. There we are. Whoops, I did it backwards. There we are. Our next speaker is Paul Harding. Paul Harding is the author of 2 prior novels about multiple generations of New England family, Enon and the Pulitzer Prize winning Tinkers. His newest book, This Other Eden, published by W.W. Norton, will be released in January of 2023. He teaches at Stony Brook, Southampton. Please welcome to the screen, Paul Harding. Let me snag here, Paul.
Hi, Alice.
How are you?
I'm
going
well.
away now.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Edward, for that great reading. Not easy following that up, but yes, I just got the advanced copy of the novel. It's coming
Yay!
in January, so I'll read a little bit from it. The novel is loosely based or inspired by an episode that happened on an island off the coast of Maine in 1912. There was the island in life is called Malaga Island, and from 1792 until 1912, it was the site of a racially integrated settlement, which was in the summer of 1912 evicted from the island by the state of Maine. So I took that basic idea, and over the years I've just been thinking about the people that live on that island and how the island is sort of like Noah's Ark, but the people can't get off the ark, or it's like the Pequod in Moby Dick, or it's like the island in the Tempest. So it's been an occasion to collage together all sorts of my very favorite authors, and see what I came up with. So this is just a couple of pages from toward the beginning of the novel. It's just about one of the families that is living on the island just before everyone is evicted. I think that's all you need to know. I'll interrupt myself if I come upon something. So their last name is Larks. The Larks lived not a quarter mile from the other families on the north end of the island, but may as well have been camped on the moon. Theophilus and Candace Lark were called cousins, but the other adult Apple Islanders, it's Apple Island in my book, knew it was most likely that they were half brother and sister, and very possibly downright brother and sister. They had been the last of the Lark family, and the last of the island's variety of traits inherited from African fathers and Irish mothers, Penobscot grandmothers, and Swedish grandpas almost seemed to have drained out of their clan, terminating nearly in the 2 wan, peaked cousins, probably siblings who had colorless hair and colorless eyes, and who, after their parents passed within 2 days of one another in the winter of 1899, out of lonesomeness and grief, continued their family together, having 9 children, 4 of whom lived, all of whom inherited their parents' pale, colorless features and fragile constitutions, and all of whom were slightly harder of hearing, slightly nearer sighted, slightly more asthmatic, wholly more sensitive to sunlight than their parents, to such an extent that except for Millie, who attended 3 hours of school each summer weekday, the Lark children were nocturnal and rarely up and about before sunset. Theophilus and Candace managed to stave off starvation for themselves and their children like everyone else. Theo was a competent fisherman and seamster and fished for cod and flounder and did the mending for the laundry that the McDermott sisters, another family on the island, Iris and Violet, took in from the mainland. The Lark children were largely left to themselves. Winters, they clustered together on the floor like a litter, often enough 1, 2, or all 3 of the semi-stray island dogs nestled among them in a nest of rags and hay and old scraps of newspaper and canvas and the blankets sent by the Relief Society. Summer nights, the children wandered over the island alone or in pairs or trios or the whole quartet in the flour sack dresses they wore, boys and girls alike, glowing under the moon against the dark earth, to appearances wandering aimlessly, spread across the meadows and woods like the ghosts of Apple Island's lost children. When Iha Honey came across the children, he's another fisherman, when Iha Honey came across the children late at night after he'd been clamming with a tide, they wordlessly encircled him, and he, anticipating, gave each of them a little neck clam or periwinkle or whelk. Sometimes he gave them oysters from his wire basket, which he shucked with his scrimshaw rigging knife, careful not to spill the broth. The girls poked the frilled, layered meat and slid it around the smooth insides of the carapaces. The boys sipped from the shells like teacups. Theophilus Lark had been a decent fisherman too, but when the Relief Society began sending food and supplies, a bowl or 2 here, a wooden spoon and a colander there, the colander disappeared the same day it arrived. The children swiped it so they could scoop sand and seaweed and shells and creatures from tide pools and watch the thin strings of water squirt from the holes. He spent more time around the shack, puttering and fussing as if tending house. He fell without a thought to caring for the kitchen utensils, which he rubbed with his rag and lined up on top of the pear crates they sometimes used for cleaning fish on. He wore a threadbare gingham dress and an old dirt and oil-stained apron that he carefully folded once over and tied around his waist as solemnly as if it were a Freemason's habit. The dress had been his mother's, the apron his grandfather's. Theophilus's grandfather had been a clerk in a shop on the mainland in some small town Theophilus could not remember the name of. Theophilus and Candace's mother had once told them that whenever a female customer entered the shop, their grandfather met the customer right there at the entrance before she'd even closed the door behind her, wearing this very apron I got on now, their mother had said, and he'd ask her, "What lack ye, ma'am?" Every time, just like that, "What lack ye, ma'am?" So Theophilus poked around the shack and brooded over the pile of sleeping children like a mother robin, wearing the dress and shopkeeper's apron. And whenever any islander passed by, he paused at his aimless chores and rose from the chair outside the door and came to the edge of the dirt yard and wrung his hands in an old red rag he took from the apron's front pocket, nodded at the passerby and said, "What lack ye, Mr. Diamond? What lack ye, Iha Honey?" To the children he asked, what lack ye, my little salted cods? What lack ye, my little oysters?" Candace Lark never liked housekeeping and was no good at it anyway. A particular squalor surrounded the Lark's shack when she had been in charge of domestic order. Much of that had been due to the children, who arrived one after another for 8 years, counting the 5 that didn't live. But even considering mother and scant means and the necessity of staying home while Theophilus fished, Candace lacked instinct for tending her kids and shack. Candace was relieved at first that she no longer had to make a show of keeping house. Then she grew bored. Theophilus fiddled with the utensils, and the children slept most of the day and were free to come and go as they liked all night. So she grew irritated by her brother's fussiness with the bowls and spoons and mug. It was as though he were playing shopkeeper. She kept silent because he meant well and she loved him, but watching him hum and wipe out the inside of the mug with his rag and hold it up to the light and look inside and blow into it as if to get the last of the dust out of it, then rub the inside with the rag again, then hold it up and look inside it again, made her want to snatch the mug and smash it on a rock and shout, "The blasted Christing mug is clean." So she began to fish. One morning, Theophilus sat outside working his rag around the wooden bowl when Candace emerged from the shack wearing his leaky waders, carrying his hand line, hooks, and leaders. "Going fishing," she said. Theophilus nodded. "It looks so," he said. "Do you want that I should?" "Nope." "Is the dory all set?" "Yep. I'll see you at sundown." Candace spent the day on the water, learning to keep her balance, standing in the unsteady, narrow dory and bobbing the line up and down, jigging for what exactly she did not know. She used some leftover chum Theophilus had in a bucket that smelled so horrendous when she took the cover off, she gagged and nearly gave up. But she turned away and took a deep breath and wiped the tears streaming down her face and figured the stench was probably good for attracting fish. She baited the gangs of hooks on both lines and dropped them into the water and began to joggle them up and down. Iha passed at a distance in his pea pod, and Candace waved and he waved back. The ocean teemed, lavish and wholesome. Sunlight fell across Candace's face and bare arms, sharp, antiseptic, fortifying. The air tasted full of salt and restorative minerals and felt invigorating to breathe deep into her lungs. The water pleated into little toppling waves and smoothed, then puckered again. Candace's long hair whipped across her face. She'd have Theo shave her head the next morning, she decided. The day and the work exhausted and enthralled her. The Lark children awoke that evening, rose from the floor and left the shanty to begin their roaming. As they started off, they met their mother, panting and bedraggled on the path, smiling, cradling a 20-pound cod with the handline, jig, and drail piled on top of it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. There we go. Our next speaker is Hilma Wolitzer. Hilma Wolitzer is the author of several novels, including An Available Man, Summer Reading, The Doctor's Daughter, Hearts, Ending, and Tunnel of Love, as well as a nonfiction book, The Company of Writers. She is the recipient of the Guggenheim and NEA Fellowships and an award in literature for the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her most recent book is a short story collection, Today, A Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket Stories, and it's just come out in paperback. She has taught writing at the University of Iowa, New York University, and Columbia University. Please welcome to the screen, Hilma Wolitzer.
Thank you, Alice.
Of course.
Thank you. I'm going to read half a story because I don't have enough time to read the whole story. It's included in my recent collection, but I think it's important to tell you that it was first written and published in 1976. Some of the stories in the collection are more than 50 years old, and one of them is brand new. This story is called Photographs. We were married in those dark ages before legalized abortion. I know that's no excuse. There were always illegal abortions, but my social circles were limited and unsophisticated. The doctors in my life were of the old-fashioned tongue depressor variety. I knew vaguely about worldly women who flew down to tropical places to have safe, painless surgery and probably even had time to get in a little sun and dance the karaoke. But I had never even been in an airplane. And the stories I knew by heart were of girls in the back rooms of drugstores after hours, hapless girls whose blood came in fountains. My mother dreamt of being a grandmother someday. It appeared to be her goal in life. She'd had me late, and I was an only child, having denied passage to any future brothers and sisters. My mother claimed that a few months after, everything had simply fallen out of her one day. As a young, misinformed girl, I had pictured the worst, a giblet tangle of fallopian tubes, ovaries, and the little pear-shaped uterus lying useless on the bathroom floor. But first I had been born, dropped in agony like an oversized egg from a disconsolate chicken. And way behind schedule, my mother was impatient for the natural progression of events. When I was 20, my goal was to lie meshed with Howard forever. Sex, which I had discovered like everyone else in the misery of childhood, had finally advanced to the ultimate stage of partnership. And what a partner I had. I recognized with awe the glorious territory we had discovered together in such blind and blundering exploration. Later, lying in bed, in trouble already, I kept a wad of Kleenex and a flashlight for undercover checking. Nothing. There was probably still a chance that I was mistaken, or that my body was only giving me some punitive suspense. As I had assured Howard, it was my safe time, and our pleasure didn't have to be deferred for the sake of caution. Of course, he had hardly waited anyway, had barely missed a stroke. Howard advised hot baths. He lent me weights to lift. We ran 40 laps around a neighborhood school track and then collapsed panting in the high grass behind it. All the evidence was in. What do you want to do? He asked. You know, I said. What about you? His eyes shifted restlessly, and I imagined my mother's pride and joy, a slender gelatinous thread riding the sewer currents of Queens. Are you afraid, Paulie? Howard asked, and I knew then that he was. I made him say it anyway. Of what? Of, I don't know, of complications. Aren't you? I said. What a mess it could be. I concentrated, forcing terrible mental pictures at him. He shuddered, receiving my message. I couldn't help thinking that men whose mothers have established an early habit of guilt in them are probably the easiest. So that's it, Howard said, and we were engaged. I threw my arms around him, sealing the bond. It will be wonderful, I promised. We'll have a wonderful life together. We'll have terrific good luck. I can feel it. He hugged me back, but all I could really feel were the drumbeat, the doom beat of his heart and the collapsing walls of his will. I planned to go on a diet right after the baby was born. In the meantime, I was growing, stretching my skin to translucency, to an iridescent glow. Howard assured me that he loved me this way, statuesque, he called it. But I'm nobody's fool. I saw him look through women's magazines and pause with wistful concentration at those slender models in the brassiere ads. If in his secret heart he wanted me to be slim and trim, I would be. Those magazines were full of easy formulas I could follow. The thinking woman's diet, the drinking woman's diet, the shrinking woman's diet. It would be a cinch. But in the meantime, I kept growing, while inside my bulk, the future me stepped daintily, waiting for release. The baby grew too in its confinement, pulsed and sounded its limits, and Howard was madly in love with it. It was a romance he had never experienced before. Of course, he had always had women. Even now, they still saw him out. I watched narrow-eyed as new ones came up, threatened and disappeared. But Howard was a family man now, and I was the monument to his new life. We went to visit other couples who nested in their apartments. Judy and Lenny Miller had a little girl named Roberta. Her toys were always in evidence. A vaporizer was her constant bedside companion. Howard and I tiptoed in to admire her. When she was awake, she was a fresh kid, the kind who screams whenever she speaks, and who answers civil, friendly questions with "no, stupid," a precocious kid who makes nose picking a public performance. But now the vaporizer's steam curls her hair into heartbreaking tendrils. We whispered in the shrine, made reverent by the miracle. When we tiptoed back to the living room, I thought, Howard doesn't even feel trapped. He actually wants a baby, wants this whole homely seam for his own. And I hadn't really trapped him anyway, had I? Isn't the sperm the true aggressor? those little Weissmullers breaststroking to their destiny? Or is the egg the bully, after all, waiting in ambush, ready to mug the first innocent stray? In the Millers' living room, all conversation came back to the inevitable subject. My doctor said he never saw anything like her, Judy said. He had real tears streaming down his face when he held Roberta up. It might have been sweat, I thought. Motherhood could make some women whitewash anything. Then Judy began talking about the natural childbirth course they had taken, where she had learned to breathe the right way during labor so that she was able to be a really active member of the delivery team. Lenny had been there too. It was a beautiful experience, he said. Most of the time, we're working against nature in the births of our children. It's hypocrisy to keep the father outside, a stranger at the gates, so to speak. What a metaphor. He advised Howard not to be that notorious slacker, the biological father who drops his seed and runs. Lenny had been right there, rubbing Judy's back, speaking encouragement, talking and stroking his child into the world. I could sense Howard's excitement. Then Judy brought out the photographs. Lenny was careful to hand them to us in proper chronological sequence. Judy, huge, horizontal on the delivery table. Himself, the masked robber of innocence, smiling at her with his eyes. The doctor glistening with sweat, tears, his hand upward and lost to view. Oh God, what was I doing? Judy grimacing, clenching, contracting, all her agonies reflected in the other faces. See, Lenny pointed out, I was in labor too. Then, here she comes, he said, handing us the one with the emerging head, a small, bloodied and determined ball. Judy's own head was lifted in an effort to watch, and she was smiling. Then triumph, the whole family united at last on this shore. Mortal, tender, exquisite. These were winning photos. There was no denying that. Howard was speechless with emotion. And I'll stop there.
I think we're supposed to carry on a conversation.
Yes,
here.
I think so too. What should we talk about? I'd like to ask you, Ed, what it's like to go from film and scripts to writing direct prose. I was once told about a script I'd written that I was being chastised. They said, a script is not about writing.
No, I think a screenplay, a script is much closer to poetry than it is to prose. I think that things stand in for other things. I think that it's almost like there's a scansion, the way there'd be a rhyme scheme and a villanelle and a scansion and a meter, and you conform to that very limited sort of template, and you have to fit it all within that. So it becomes very compressed and very reductionist, I think, in certain ways.
And you also allow for other people, like the director and the actors and all that. So in a way, it becomes collaborative.
That's right. And it's so funny that you would ask me that, because I was going to ask, I know that you've written screenplay before, and I know that Paul is a musician. And I was really interested in that transition because, you know, how much does music then figure into the kind of prose that's, you know, these sort of pollinizations.
I didn't know about the music, Paul. What do you? Well, I was a drummer. So, you know, that's not as a musician, you know, I've said this before, the whole repertoire of dumb drummer jokes. That's the reputation that, you know, what do you call the guy that follows the band from town to town and all that stuff. But no, I think I'm fascinated with these, you know, the synthesis, or how, you know, the syntheses out of which something is produced. I mean, one of the things I was actually thinking of as you were talking was not so much having been a drummer or a musician, but having played music and collaborated, you know, when you play with other musicians. And so there's that, you give and take according to what you're getting sort of from other people, and you're continually sort of refining and shaping what you're saying, as it were, according to other people. And then writing, it feels much, you know, so much more solitary in some ways. But yeah, what you were just saying about about the rhythm and the scansion and the metrics. And I mean, I certainly, as a former drummer, I think rhythmically. I often know what time signature and tempo and how many beats are going to be in a sentence before I literally know what it means. It's very sort of improvisational and very, I feel like I'm sort of taking dictation in some ways, you know.
Do you read your work aloud the way you would listen to music?
Not, I mean, sometimes I do just to make sure that there aren't those extra beats or whatever, but not too much. I mean, this is, I'm sort of interested to know what the two of you think about this. I've been thinking more, or not with great conviction or, you know, dogmatically, but just thinking, you know, poetry is meant to be, is like a form of singing. It's a form of song. But when I write prose, I think I'm actually writing it to be read in silence, as it were, and not necessarily out loud. I think for a while I found myself writing too much for stuff to be kind of read out loud, and I realized people will be reading this to themselves. It's not quite recitative like poetry.
Well, what I would ask Hilma is that you know, in a play, or even particularly a screenplay, you know that if you've written more than a scene that's more than 2 pages or 3 pages, which is in fact mostly dialogue, that's as long as it's ever going to be. So you were prescribed. And yet when you're writing prose, the scene is as long as it needs to be. And the speeches are,
yeah,
or the descriptions, or the internal monologue. And that's sort of the fact that it's boundless, that in me would produce a kind of terror, because I know that I'm working within some kind of prescribed limits, but you're not.
but you're disciplined and I'm not, and maybe that works out. I'm a very undisciplined writer, though I have to say, I like reading poetry. I've written some poems. I can't even call it poetry, but I like reading poetry for the musicality and for the economy. It really teaches me to write less, and it's still perfectly fine to cross out all these words. In fact, this is not the full version of this half of the story. I cut a lot of it out to fill in, to be correct for this time frame.
Yeah, remarkable to find out, remarkable how much you could cut out, right?
Yeah, you know, I used to tell my students that less was more, and that I was going to reduce their 4-generation sagas to haiku.
Oh, that's great. It's funny how there's those aesthetics. I mean, I end up writing relatively short books. You know, this new one, the longest one that I've written, is only going to be published at maybe 220 pages. But I love reading long books. We were talking about like Moby Dick earlier, and so kind of as a reader, I think more is more, as long as it's good, you know, as long as it's sustained. But I couldn't write a book like that. And then conversely, the other extreme, I can look at, say, Emily Dickinson's little metaphysical nuggets and just marvel at how she could possibly compress so much into such a small, concise, succinct poem.
I have to say, Paul, that I was thrilled when you won the Pulitzer for that wonderful novel.
Oh, thank you. I was too.
It was it's a terrific book.
Very kind. That's very kind.
A terrific book, and I know it was a relatively small press, so it must have been very thrilling for them as well.
It was great. It was, I mean, it just literally, it was absurd. It was ridiculous. It was sort of absurd, and it only seems more absurd as time goes on. But that was actually the great thing, is that the book kind of had this wonderful plot line that went with it, which is I couldn't get it published, and then it was published by Bellevue Literary Press, which was a janitor's closet at the hospital, basically. So it was really a privilege to be able to go around the tour afterwards and just name check all the independent bookstores and booksellers and people that work for independent presses, and just kind of be the ambassador for it. So that's very kind of you. Thank you. It's very unreal, strange experience.
And I understand you and I have something in common. My daughter Meg told me that you wrote for Family, or you directed it.
That was actually my first job. And I think you had preceded me. I think you'd written for the show, I think just before one episode. Well, that was, my first my baptism, in fact, was for that show. And in fact, I know Meg, I don't know if she's listening now, but I know that she and Martha are partners, and Martha's a good friend of mine too. So there are many connections there.
I love them all, I must say. Yeah. That was an experience for me. That's when I found out that all my adjectives and adverbs didn't work.
Yeah.
And, it was, I don't know if you know David Jacobs. He
Oh,
worked
that's in fact, that's who hired me to actually come on and write that show. Yes.
Well, David and I were in a writing workshop together at the New School a billion years ago. And to save the tuition, the instructor was Anatole Bourriard, who later became a daily book reviewer for the New York Times. He allowed me into the course without paying tuition if I would read manuscripts for people coming into the class. And David was one of the people I led into the class.
Oh, that's great. Well,
And-
he had left. He said, when I went to meet him, he said he was leaving because he had written this pilot that about rich people in Texas, and he thought that's what
The rest is history.
It's history, right? The rest is a beach house in Malibu.
Yeah, we're still good friends.
That's good. I think an interesting thing to talk about for me too, for you guys, is adaptation, because so often, I'm given the job, and I've done it many times, of adapting novels, and have had to confront the reality that, in fact, it's impossible to even think that what you're doing is an adaptation of a novel, that finally I've had to admit that it's the creation of a different thing, because the more I try to be slavish to the novel, the less good the movie's going to be. And if you think about it, even with your books, Paul, that, you can read your books maybe in a couple of days.
Oh, yeah.
But a movie, you're not going to have more than a couple of hours. And so the experience of it is so necessarily reductionist and compressed that when they try to do adaptations of movies, what they do so badly, to me, by my lights, is to contain the plot. And what you have is plot, which is antithetical to what a good novel is. You don't dwell in the internal lives of the characters. You don't feel the room around them. And I think it's very interesting to me that finally, in some of this long form television, they've done what the Brits have done better. Like the difference would be the adaptation of the Le Carré books, where you would see those wonderful Alec Guinness 6-8 hour adaptations, and it felt more like the experience of a book. Whereas when they tried to do it as a 2-hour movie, it was just garbage. I remember when they tried to adapt Garp as a movie, and it had nothing to do with what the experience was of the book.
I think you have to let go as the novel.
That's right.
It's somebody else's work now, and it's a different form. And unfortunately, I've never had the experience. I'm always an option, never a bride. I had so many options, I can't even count them. And at first, I was foolish enough to believe that if somebody optioned your book, it was actually going to be made. And my very first book was optioned by Bob Fosse.
There you go.
And I just assumed, and then it wasn't made. And then I learned that I wasn't in this for the money.
I think it was Faulkner who said the way to have your book optioned is to take it to this California state line and throw it onto across the other side and go back.
That's very funny.
No, I think that's right. I like that you can have the longer form with the cable television show, because I think that's the one of the ways that novels anyways achieve their effects is cumulative. You actually, it's foreshortened, but you live in the book, you live in the world of the book. And so it's just the lived experience with the material that builds up. Somebody did just option Tinkers, and it's just, it cashed the very tiny little check and said, best of luck with that. But I think that's right. I feel like the people I know who have had movies made of their books, the advice they've said to me is just, you just hope that they make a good movie. That's all.
I just hope they make a movie, frankly, but
yeah, that's true, right. And then
I
it
have
goes,
to be
well.
honest about that.
And
I had a wonderful experience with Jim Harrison.
Yeah.
Because when he wrote Legends of the Fall was a novella, so therefore it was already short, but he told me it was almost like automatic writing for him. He had come upon these papers in the chest of one of his family homes, and had a kind of fever dream, a kind of Coleridge fever dream, where he dreamt the story, woke up and wrote it in about 36, cocaine fueled hours. But that's where it came from. And so therefore it had this kind of driving oral tradition narrative to it. And that actually helped in terms of the adaptation.
Right. Yeah. It was never made into a movie, but I remember Faulkner talking about, he wrote As I Lay Dying in just one straight shot in like 4 weeks.
Well, I mean, a couple of movies I've seen that I felt really did justice to the book and didn't ruin the book for me. One was Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, 2 books that I really love. Part of it, of course, was Newman and Woodward being so wonderful, but I think that it was really put together very well. And the other one that really surprised me was my favorite short story, The Dead. I didn't really want to see it because I didn't want anything to destroy my feeling about the story, and yet it was there somehow.
But it was, but indeed, it was a short story, not a novel, which is, I think,
that's true.
changed.
It doesn't have to be condensed so much.
Right.
Yeah, to this day, I haven't seen the film version of Housekeeping, the book by Marilyn Robinson.
I haven't seen that either, and that's
such an idea of that book in it's so intrinsic on a cellular level. I don't want to.
But just to contradict it, I don't know if you've ever seen David Lean's adaptation of Great Expectations, and it is a complete work. And I don't know how he does that, because it's a kind of magic. I think though, because the iconic imagery is so strong, I think it's maybe because of familiarity with the novel, what remains are these very salient, bright moments, and he hits them as you move through them, and somehow they do resonate in a way that they often don't with adaptations.
Right.
I mean, you can't get someone with your sensibility exactly to adapt a novel.
Right. And that makes me think, I'm just, so fascinated with filmmaking and with directing, I admire it from afar, but I was just thinking about Billy Wilder or Raoul Walsh or some of these people who could just make good movies out of any subject.
Right.
You want a comedy? You got one. Here's the best one you've ever seen. You want a Western? This one's pretty, and so that idea of just being able to take, the essential scenes, the essential moments, and be able to tell the story, show the story, that process of distillation, I think.
Well, I mean, but I think they also, this is where great acting and it comes in, is because the way that 2 people can light a cigarette or light one another's cigarette, and now Voyager, that stuff fills in, a lot of prose.
That for some reason that's making me a different director, but the moment in The Searchers where the sister-in-law is looking at John Wayne and she's obviously in love with him, and it's so astonishing. It's so deep and resonant, and it just passes, and it resonates through the rest of the movie.
But do you think that some of the movies have had a counterintuitive effect on the actual writing of novels, though? Of course they have.
Well, I loved going to the movies ever since I was a child. I was allowed, my mother had another baby when I was 7 years old. And so I was shipped off to the movie where there was a matron, this woman in a white uniform who ran around with her flashlight looking for trouble in the children's section, which she never found. And I remember I sat in the front row because I couldn't be close enough to the screen. I loved it. I loved the story. I loved everything about it. And I used to come home, close the bathroom door, and talk the story back to myself in the mirror. So I don't know whether I was becoming a writer or just wallowing in the whole idea of movies, which I've always loved.
Yeah, they're immersive. I mean, a book will do that too, or a symphony will do that as well. But that sense of just being sort of implicated, and just becoming kind of coextensive with the work of art, and just being literally enthralled by it and sustained. The idea you can. You're sustained through an entire movie or an entire piece of music or an entire book. It's just that's what we shoot for, anyways.
Yeah, I think about what's happened even to, I mean, you could always put down a book, but you could never put down a movie. And now that people can hold that remote in their hand, or you know, the experience of going to a movie used to be ephemeral.
Right.
You would go to the movie theater and you would have that experience only once, and therefore it would have this kind of desperate attention to it. And now with the opportunity to not just rewind it or see it again or see it at some other time, or to be distracted by your phone or by anything else, it's an entirely different experience, where a book is not a different experience than it used to be. A book is the same experience, except when it comes to audiobooks.
Right.
And audiobooks, I mean, which I've become, you know, very, fond of in certain cases, depending on the reader, are somehow bridging that gap, I think, because it is a theatrical experience as you're just listening to it in a different way based on the reader.
Mhm.
And my husband and I used to drive for about 3.5 hours every weekend. We had a little house and we would listen to audio tapes. There were like 100 tapes for one
Sure.
book. And I remember Derek Jacobi reading Fathers and Sons, Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, and he acted out every part. It was thrilling. And then there was, I believe it was a Miss Marple, not a Miss Marple, but I think it was an Agatha Christie. I'm not sure. It was called Murder Must Advertise, which was terrific. It was not only a good mystery, but it told me everything about the advertising business. And I love novels that do this. Novels, I mean, I think of Philip Roth talking about making gloves.
Right.
Yeah, an
I
American.
love
Girl.
learning
Yep.
things from
Yeah.
novels.
You know, there's one that I remember from that period. There was Judith Ivey doing a reading of Alan Gurganis's The Oldest Living Confederate Tells All, that was about as good a one-man performance, one-woman performance that I had ever seen or heard in my entire life. It's as if I had seen it and I did not see it. I had only heard it.
Alan is a wonderful writer.
Oh, yeah.
He's an old friend and a wonderful writer.
He's got the best ghost stories too.
He's
Yeah.
good at everything.
Yeah, yeah. I made the mistake of doing the audio for one of my books because I thought I'm pretty good at giving readings. You know, I got into the studio and I realized it's acting. It's a whole different thing.
Oh,
The
boy.
producer saying, "Can you make that sound a little bit more like a 13-year-old girl?" I was like, "No, I can't. What have I done?" I have several hundred spare copies if anybody wants one to prop up their
There's-
couch that's unbalanced.
There's actually a young woman who I cast when she was 14 years old in a television show. Her name is Julia Whalen, who has become the sort of diva voice of the New York Times. If you listen to any of those recordings in autumn now, she's sort of it. It's kind of great.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, Adrian made a comment in the chat about what about the adaptation of the short story Brokeback Mountain? I thought the screenplay filled in the story between the story on the page. And that was her comment.
That's called subtext. I mean, there is the text, and the subtext is because of their internal experience of that character, or just the inhabiting of a physical space, or the physiognomy, or the lighting, or everything else. It gives you a whole inner world, particularly if the performance is filled in a way. And obviously those two performances were so extraordinary.
I just thought it was a really great point that she made. I have a question for the three of you. When you're writing, what comes first, the plot or the characters, and why, or what's the background?
Well, as I said before, I think that I'm usually asked by members of the audience at a reading where I get my ideas, and I say I don't get any ideas. My characters get ideas, and they tell them to me. I get characters first, always, and I get the voice of the character speaking in my head. So I will start with a sentence, the way a poet usually starts as well. And if another sentence follows and another sentence follows, I may be on my way to a story or a novel. And sometimes I can be 75 pages in and realize it's not going anywhere. You know, Joseph Heller wrote a novel called Something Happened. My novel would be called Nothing Happened. You know, I would just abandon it.
Alvin Sargent, who was one of the great screenwriters of all time, he once said something to me. He said, plot is the thing that the burglar climbs up the wall and throws to the dogs to distract them so he can climb over and get the jewels, which are the characters.
Wow,
What a great quote.
Isn't that a good one?
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
going to borrow that.
You
Paul,
got it.
I've seen you nodding. I'm assuming that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's certain, there's a certain type of, you have your own disposition, your own aesthetic. But I definitely get character first. I mean, my plots, I live in terror of like the elevator pitch. Well, there's this guy and he's in bed and he's about to die, and then he thinks about his dad and then he dies. It's like where I write the check to. So anti-plot, but it's utterly character. I'm interested in that kind of, experiential sort of thing. But I also often get ideas come to me almost like photographs, like still photographs, like who are you? Who is that sitting there? Who is that, on the hill at midnight under the moon? Who are you? And I just start describing whatever that little snapshot is, or like Hilma was saying, I hear a voice. And I understand what they're saying, but I just start taking dictation. You try to capture it. And then like as you alluded to, you sometimes write 100 pages and get to the end of it and say, that's exactly what that's not about.
Even if I'd never describe a character, I would know what the character looks like. And
Right.
David Jacobs once asked me when one of my movies was optioned, one of the ones that was never made, who I imagined would play the starring role. I said, nobody. She's herself. She has an overbite. She walks funny. I mean, I don't know. I can't even describe her to anybody else. So I couldn't imagine a particular actress playing the part.
Well, in my business, you're best not to, because you're inevitably going to be disappointed or have to revise your imagination.
Your business sounds like one disappointment after the other, I have to say, except for your case.
Well, that is the definition of success. It's going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm, right?
Oh, wow. Now I want to ask the three of you, what emerging author that you might know about that you would like to share with us so that we can learn some new people?
I wrote this down because I knew you were going to ask that. I'm not teaching now, so I don't know. I'm not familiar with a lot of young writers, but I was on a panel about a week or two ago with three young writers. I mean, everybody's young to me. Everybody's younger than I am, but these writers seem very promising. One was Adam Dalva. Another one was Megan Cummins. Adam Dalva has written essays, I know, in the New Yorker and other places. And Megan Cummins won a prize from the University of Nebraska Press. And the other one was a flash fiction writer and an editor named Jesse Alvarez. And they all seem so interesting to me. I'm just starting to read them now.
Paul, do you have anybody to share with us?
Yeah, I'm gonna put her name just in the chat. Her name is oops, sorry. Her name is Mahahodi Makhene, and she's a South African writer. She has a collection, a debut collection of interconnected stories called Innards, that's coming out, I think, in March.
What is it called?
Innards, as in like the innards, guts.
Right.
And I think that it's particularly spectacular.
Great title.
Yeah, it's her story. The stories are just astonishing. They're just really, really incredible. I actually picked one of her. She was a student of mine for briefly at Iowa, and I begged her for a story because I was guest editing an issue of the Harvard Review. She gave it to me. We published it, and it was a finalist for the Kane Prize, which is the sort of Pan-African kind of literary prize. So it's just top quality, top caliber.
I've been writing while you all are talking. Ed, do you have anybody you want to share with us?
No, I said to you before we began, no, the only young writer that I've been reading is my daughter, who is a second-year fellow at the Mishner Center, who has just had her first short story published, actually.
Brava.
Congratulations.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
Her name is
That's great.
Frankie Zwick, and I hope you'll be hearing from her, but who knows?
I'll look out.
There you go.
The last question of the evening, because we do have to wind it down, is what are you reading now?
I've just finished my pal Kurt Anderson's book Fantasyland, which I had intended to read a couple of years ago when it came out, and it's a kind of spiritual cousin to his first book called Evil. No, actually, it is the precedent to this book Evil Geniuses that he wrote a couple of years ago. It's a wonderful book, and it's so prescient about this moment, about the death of facts and the delusion, the culture of delusion which we all live. And it's a really remarkable book, and it traces the history, a narrative history of America, starting with the sort of the progress of religion, going all the way up to Trumpism. It's a really wonderful history.
I have 3 books that I'm excited about. One is by Elizabeth Mccracken, and it's called The Hero of This Book. And it's kind of a memoir dressed as a novel.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny and it's moving and it's staying in my head, which is always a good sign. Another one is 100 Saturdays by Michael Frank, which is a story of a 99-year-old woman, a real woman named Stella Levy, who Michael Frank meets with on Saturday. And she tells him the story of the purging and extermination of Jews in Rhodes.
Mm.
And it's also the story of her life. It's so engaging, it's so moving, and it's got these beautiful illustrations by Mara Kalman. And the third one I just finished reading, which is Betty Howland's book, Things to Come and Go, 3 novellas with a marvelous introduction by Rumaan Alam. I'd highly recommend all 3 of those books.
Great. I always have a hard time figuring out what I'm reading because I'm always reading like 50 books. I just have them all over the house. I read 5 or 10 pages at a time, and then for years I don't finish a book, and then suddenly I finish 50 of them at once. So, but I've been reading. This is an old thing from the the Brookings Institute, and it's all about the history of the Voting Rights Act, and it's instructive because pretty much exactly what's going on right now, the misadventures with changing election laws and accessibility and everything, is just a retaking up of the same states that were in the Confederacy that the Voting Rights Act was designed to stop, because it just didn't stop at that disenfranchisement and began after Reconstruction and just never stopped. And it's just the second the Supreme Court gutted, Section 5 out of the act. It was they hadn't missed a beat. Immediately went back to disenfranchising everybody.
We're marching backwards.
Yeah,
I can't believe it. I'm 92 years old, and I grew up in the Depression and World War II, and I felt patriotic. I still love my country, what's left of it, but I don't like a lot of the people who have been running it, and it's heartbreaking to me.
Yeah, the monomania, just the unceasing, unsleeping kind of obsession with just disenfranchising Black people. It's just,
and with just having power, not any idea of serving the country, just a matter of retaining power.
Right.
And by the way, that's why I evoke those 2 books. Because they trace it's a linear progression that you can follow in a very clear and discernible way, and he manages to do that. That's just what I was referring to too.
Yeah.
Well, vote often and early, folks.
I think you're preaching to the choir in this particular case, because
I'm afraid so.
But we all need to be reminded. Well, folks, this has been a wonderful evening, and I really appreciate your time and sharing your wonderful work with all of us. I am going to minimize you and then say goodnight for the evening. as sad as that can be. I would like to thank Ed, Paul, and Hilma for participating in Write America this evening, and to everyone who tuned in tonight. And thank you to Roger Rosenblatt for creating this wonderful and original and important series to look forward to each Monday evening. Tonight's episode is the perfect example of the purpose and mission of Write America. We hope to see you all next week on Monday, October 24th, as we welcome Lindsay Atkins and Wally Marzano Lesnevich. Please remember to check out Bird's Book's Write America page, where you can find out information about our upcoming episodes and maybe purchase a book or two. Thank you all for joining. Good night.
All right.